blood and power. These would one day define Henry VIII's name, but at the beginning, the story was very different. Long before the swollen tyrant gasped for breath in his final winter, England had seen in him the promise of glory. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was a dazzling figure. Just 17 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and full of energy, he seemed the very image of Renaissance majesty. Foreign ambassadors marveled at his skill with languages, music, and theology. At tournaments, he rode like a knight from legend, knocking opponents from their horses with strength and precision. At court, he was a golden-haired prince whose laughter carried through the halls. Europe looked to him not as a butcher, but as a beacon of youth, vigor, and intelligence. England, weary from the cautious and frugal reign of his father, Henry VII, rejoiced in the young monarch. Here was no miserly king. Here was a ruler who hosted lavish banquets, composed songs, and promised victories. His charisma won him loyal admirers. His very presence inspired hope of a brilliant age. But even in those early years, ambition burned behind the charm. Henry hungered for recognition not just as England's ruler, but as a monarch who could stand equal to the great kings of Europe. He longed for glory in battle, eager to be remembered as a warrior like his ancestors. The young Henry spoke often of honor, conquest, and the divine duty of kings. The court basked in his brightness, but shadows already stirred at the edges. Beneath the smiles and pageantry lay a man who could not bear defiance. He demanded loyalty not as a gift, but as an unshakable right. Those who disappointed him found his temper fierce, though it was quick to fade in those days. Few could have guessed that this sharpness of spirit would one day harden into cruelty. In those first years, Henry was still the Prince of Promise, still the athlete leaping into the lists, still the musician who played the lute for his companions, still the husband who proudly showed his queen, Catherine of Aragon, before the cheering crowds. Yet the seeds of the future, of suspicion, of hunger for absolute control, had already been sown. Time and illness would water them, until they grew into the monstrous figure who terrified even his closest friends. For now, though, in the opening chapter of his reign, Henry VIII stood as the golden hope of Tudor England, admired, adored, and feared only by those who looked more deeply into his restless soul. The Golden Prince, who had once dazzled Europe with his strength and charm, did not remain untouched by fate. As the years passed, Henry VIII's body, once an instrument of vigor, began to betray him. What started as minor injuries slowly grew into afflictions that reshaped not only his health, but also his very character. In his youth, Henry had been addicted to sport. Jousting above all thrilled him, the thunder of hooves, the crash of lances, the roar of the crowd. Yet it was this passion that planted the roots of his decline. Repeated falls in the lists left him with lasting injuries. One in particular, a terrible accident in 1536, when a horse toppled onto him, would prove devastating. Henry was thrown to the ground, his legs crushed, his body bruised. He never fully recovered. The once tireless king soon found himself plagued with leg ulcers that refused to heal. They swelled, burst, and festered, filling his chambers with a stench so foul that courtiers struggled not to gag. Treatments of boiled onions, vinegar, and even ground human bone were applied, but nothing truly eased the agony. The young athlete who had run, hunted, and danced now limped in constant pain. As his body faltered, so too did his temper. The king's famous outbursts grew sharper, more frequent, and more dangerous. Where once he had been quick to anger, but quicker to forgive, now suspicion hardened into vengeance. Friends could become enemies in a single breath. Smiles vanished, replaced with scowls and sudden fits of rage. The change was not only physical, but also political. A man who could no longer joust or dance sought glory elsewhere, in power, in control, in bending both subjects and faith to his will. The charm of the young king, who had once written music and serenaded his court, gave way to the tyranny of a monarch who demanded obedience above all. Still, the court clung to the image of Henry as he had been. Artists like Hans Holbein painted him with broad shoulders, wide stance, and blazing eyes, a portrait of majesty. Yet behind those portraits was the reality of a man whose legs throbbed with pain, whose waistline grew wider each year, and whose mind darkened with bitterness. The Golden Prince was fading. In his place, a heavier, more ruthless king was emerging, a monarch whose decline of the body would fuel the rise of a tyrant. By the mid-1540s, Henry's body was a prison, but his mind was still a battlefield. The constant pain from his ulcerated legs gnawed at his patience, and the fog of medicines like opium blurred his thoughts. What emerged from this haze was not calm reflection, but sharp paranoia. The king had always been wary, but now suspicion became the air he breathed. Every cough in the council chamber, every glance exchanged between courtiers, seemed to him a threat. His fits of rage grew more violent, followed by long stretches of lethargy in which he could barely rise from his bed. Attendants whispered that he often muttered to himself, speaking of ghosts, the wives he had condemned, the rivals he had executed, even the trusted men he had once embraced as brothers. Their imagined faces seemed to hover over him, silent accusers in the night. But while Henry's mind wavered, the machinery of politics could not rest. At the heart of his anxieties stood a single fragile figure, Prince Edward, his son by Jane Seymour. Edward was only 9, pale and sickly, yet he was the future of the Tudor line. With Henry too weak to rule, factions gathered like wolves around the boy, each eager to claim control once the king's heart finally stopped. On one side stood the Conservatives, Catholic nobles who dreamed of restoring England to Rome's embrace. On the other were the Reformers, led by Edward Seymour, the prince's uncle, who sought to push England further down the Protestant path. Both sides maneuvered quietly, planting allies in key positions, offering bribes, forging alliances. Every decision Henry made in these years was a victory for one faction and a disaster for another. The king knew this. He sensed the daggers hidden behind the bows of his courtiers. His paranoia sharpened his pen. Even as he struggled to hold it steady, he signed death warrants. Old friends were sent to the Tower. Noble houses that had prospered for decades fell overnight. Fear was his last weapon, and he wielded it mercilessly. And still, the realm was told that the king was strong, healthy, and in command. Official proclamations described him as vigorous, even as servants gagged from the stench of his ulcers and physicians fought to keep him awake. The deception was necessary, for a whisper of weakness could invite rebellion at home or invasion from abroad. But behind the incense-filled chambers of Whitehall, the truth could not be hidden. The lion was dying, and with every laboured breath, England moved closer to a storm of power struggles that would decide not just who guided the young king, but the fate of the kingdom itself. By January 1547, Henry VIII's private chambers at Whitehall had become less a royal residence and more a mausoleum in waiting. Courtiers who were granted entry described a scene both pitiful and grotesque. Heavy curtains blocked out the winter light. The royal bed, once a symbol of majesty, sagged beneath the bulk of a man swollen to nearly 400 pounds. Incense burned constantly, struggling to mask the foul odor of rotting flesh that seeped from the ulcers on his legs. Every movement was agony. When attendants tried to shift him, the king's screams echoed through the stone corridors. His ulcers festered so badly that pieces of bone may have been visible through the corrupted flesh. Physicians applied poultices of onions, herbs, and even powdered human skull, remedies born of desperation rather than science. Nothing brought relief. Only heavy doses of opium dulled his pain, but they left his mind clouded and confused. In this chamber of suffering, Henry drifted between delirium and lucidity. At times he raged, demanding that his doctors restore him as if royal command could bend nature itself. At others, he fell into nightmarish mutterings, calling out to the dead. Attendants recorded how he sometimes spoke to Anne Boleyn or Thomas More, as though their spirits stood at the foot of his bed in silent judgment. Yet even amid the stench of decay, the king clung to power. Papers were brought to his bedside, his trembling hand guided to sign decrees and death warrants. The pen scratched shakily across the parchment, but its weight still destroyed lives. Those who dared enter his chamber bowed deeply, pretending strength still flowed through the monarch, though all could see the truth. England's lion was rotting alive. The atmosphere was suffocating. Perfumed handkerchiefs became essential for courtiers, and servants rotated constantly to endure the task of cleaning the monarch's body. His face had grown bloated, his eyes sunken, his skin yellow and waxy. In the flicker of candlelight, he looked less like a king than a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. But Henry was not merely dying. He was preparing. Between fits of rage and fevered visions, he reviewed his will obsessively, determined to control his dynasty's future even from beyond the grave. He would not allow death to strip him of command. England would follow his hand, even if that hand trembled with weakness and pain. On the night of January 27, 1547, Henry's long decline reached its breaking point. Witnesses reported that the king was seized by a violent convulsion, so sudden and so fierce that attendants had to throw themselves upon him to keep his enormous body from thrashing off the bed. When the fit ended, his right side hung limp. His speech slurred, his eyes rolled, and his breath rasped with the unmistakable signs of a massive stroke. Panic swept through the chamber. The royal physicians, knowing their own lives might be forfeit if the king died under their care, rushed into frantic action. They applied hot irons to his skin in hopes of rousing him, forced bitter concoctions of herbs down his throat, and bled him according to ancient medical practice. Nothing worked. The once mighty ruler lay gasping, half paralyzed, slipping in and out of consciousness. Secrecy became paramount. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and a small circle of trusted courtiers barred the doors to the sick-room. News of the king's collapse, if allowed to spread too soon, could trigger a scramble for power, perhaps even foreign invasion. Even Queen Catherine Parr was kept at a distance, excluded during the most critical moments. Inside, silence was enforced. Every servant sworn to secrecy, every whisper suppressed. Yet within the chamber, the truth was undeniable. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air. The groans of the monarch echoed against the stone walls. Courtiers who had once trembled before his wrath now saw him helpless, his massive frame shuddering with each ragged breath. Rumors spread through Whitehall that the lion had finally lost his claws. Still, Henry's willpower flickered like a dying flame. When he managed to rally his strength, he demanded that papers be brought to him, his hand guided to scratch his final decrees. He obsessed over the regency for his young son Edward, determined to shape England's future even as his body betrayed him. By the end of that terrible day, it was clear to all who witnessed it. Henry VIII, the king who had terrified nobles, executed wives, and torn his kingdom from Rome, was at the edge of death. Only the tightening grip of his counsellors held England together, while its monarch drifted toward his last hours. As January gave way to February, Henry VIII drifted deeper into weakness. He passed between uneasy sleep and brief, startling flashes of awareness. When awake, his mind wandered. Sometimes he muttered about the ghosts of those he had destroyed, Thomas More and Boleyn Cromwell, their names falling from his lips like curses he could not escape. At other times, he called for wives long dead, as if expecting them to appear beside his bed. But his lucidity returned in fleeting moments. During these intervals, Henry turned to his will, reviewing and revising, obsessively checking the lines that secured the succession. He knew his body was collapsing, yet his ambitions stretched beyond the grave. He would not let his dynasty falter. His 9-year-old son Edward must inherit without question, and the path to the throne must remain free of rival claims. The king demanded that documents be read aloud, his failing hand guided to approve them, even as he struggled to hold the pen. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was suffocating. Incense burned constantly, struggling to hide the stench of infection rising from the ulcers that had eaten into his legs. The heavy curtains muffled sound, but the attendants could still hear the king's screams when the pain returned. Physicians applied ointments of boiled onions, resin, and even powdered skulls, hoping for relief. Only doses of opium dulled the agony, but the drug clouded his already failing mind. It was during one of his clearer spells that Archbishop Cranmer was called urgently to the bedside. He had long been Henry's spiritual adviser, guiding him through the break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England. Now, in the dim candlelight of Whitehall, Cranmer prepared himself for the king's confession. Henry could no longer speak clearly, his words thick and broken. But Cranmer leaned close and asked if the king placed his trust in Christ for salvation, rather than in rituals or ceremonies. Those gathered swore that Henry, with his last reserve of strength, squeezed the archbishop's hand in reply. It was a silent, desperate affirmation, a moment seized by Protestant chroniclers as evidence of a deathbed conversion. That night, the king lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his great body rising and falling with effort. Outside the chamber, courtiers whispered anxiously. Factions sharpened their blades of ambition, but none dared move too soon. England's most feared ruler hovered on the edge of eternity, caught between terror, guilt, and the relentless approach of death. Before dawn on January 28, 1547, the moment finally came. For days, Henry had drifted in and out of consciousness, his vast body sinking under the weight of disease and decay. That night, his attendants kept close watch. The chamber was heavy with incense, the windows sealed against the winter cold, but the foul stench of rotting flesh still seeped through. The once mighty king now lay swollen, motionless, his breath ragged and uneven. Witnesses recalled how, in the last hours, his chest heaved violently as if fighting an invisible hand. His face, once the pride of a golden prince, was bloated and discolored, the eyes sunken into shadow. A seizure racked him, so fierce that his attendants had to hold him down to prevent him from falling from the bed. When the fit ended, his right side hung limp, a sign of a massive stroke. Archbishop Cranmer had already been summoned. He leaned close and asked one final question, whether Henry trusted in Christ alone for salvation. The king could not speak, but those present swore that his hand moved faintly, squeezing Cranmer's fingers before falling still. Moments later, the royal breath slowed. Then it stopped. Silence filled the chamber. After 37 years on the throne, Henry VIII, England's most feared monarch, was dead. For a time, no one spoke. Courtiers and physicians stood frozen, the reality too great to grasp. The mighty ruler who had broken with Rome, executed wives, destroyed monasteries, and bent an entire kingdom to his will now lay lifeless, a grotesque monument to power undone by flesh. His enormous corpse, nearly 400 pounds at the end, loomed as a grim reminder of both majesty and mortality. But his death could not be announced. Not yet. The Privy Council, terrified of chaos, kept the secret sealed for 3 full days. Outside Whitehall Palace, London stirred with no knowledge that the Lion of England had breathed his last. Inside, attendants whispered of the stench growing stronger, of the incense failing to hide it, of a body already beginning to betray the silence of death. Henry VIII had passed from king to corpse, but in the shadows of the court, his final game of power had only just begun. The death of Henry VIII did not bring peace. Instead, his body itself became a spectacle of horror. Almost immediately, decomposition set in. His vast frame, swollen by disease and heavy with infection, began to break down at a terrifying speed. Servants whispered that the smell of decay grew unbearable, forcing attendants to keep windows wide open despite the freezing January air. Royal embalmers were summoned to perform their work, but even they struggled with the task. The body was so large that a coffin had to be specially constructed, twice the width of a noble's standard casket. Inside, his organs were removed, cavities packed with herbs and aromatic substances, yet the rot had already advanced too far. His diseased liver and bloated heart shocked those who cut into him, evidence of years of gluttony, infection, and hidden illness. Despite the embalmer's efforts, his remains continued to swell. The lead-lined coffin groaned under the pressure, and at Whitehall Chapel, during his lying in state, disaster struck. Gas from decomposition built until the coffin cracked, leaking foul fluids onto the floor. Rumors spread that dogs licked at the seepage before attendants drove them away, a grotesque final humiliation for a king obsessed with grandeur. Courtiers hushed the story, but the whispers spread nonetheless. Henry's body had betrayed him, just as his flesh had done in life. Meanwhile, preparations for the funeral carried on. Black-draped horses were harnessed, wax effigies made to show Henry as he had been in his prime, tall, broad-shouldered, commanding. It was this image, not the bloated corpse sealed in the coffin, that the Tudors wanted England to remember. His body was transported slowly to Windsor, where he would be laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son and the only one he never cast aside. Yet even here, irony lingered. His elaborate tomb, which Henry had once envisioned as a towering monument crowned with bronze statues, was never completed. Financial strain and political upheaval left him buried in a far plainer grave than he had ever intended. Thus the king who had demanded to be remembered as England's mightiest monarch entered eternity amid rot, cracked coffins, and secrecy. His corpse was silent, but the myth of Henry VIII had already begun to grow louder than the man himself. Henry VIII's final journey through England became as much a political theatre as a funeral. On February 16, 1547, a massive black-draped procession left London for Windsor Castle. Horses covered in velvet pulled the reinforced coffin, which was accompanied by heralds, nobles, and clergy. Along the route, thousands gathered to watch in silence, some mourning sincerely, others quietly relieved that the tyrant's reign was over. Atop the coffin rested a wax effigy of Henry, not the diseased and swollen figure he had become, but the broad-shouldered warrior king of Hans Holbein's famous portrait. The effigy stood as propaganda, reminding the people of Henry's strength, even as his real body rotted inside the casket. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor, Henry was buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his only legitimate son. This was not a coincidence, but a carefully chosen image. Henry wished to be remembered as a strong father who secured the Tudor dynasty. The grand monument he had planned, complete with towering bronze statues, was never built. Instead, he rested in a far plainer tomb, his ambition outstripping the resources of those he left behind. While the public watched the spectacle, behind the scenes the struggle for power was already underway. The 9-year-old Edward VI had been declared king, but real authority fell to his uncle, Edward Seymour, now Lord Protector. He moved quickly and ruthlessly, securing fortresses, neutralizing rivals, and establishing himself as the true power behind the throne. For the Tudor court, the funeral marked not an ending, but the beginning of a dangerous transition. Conservative Catholics, led by the Duke of Norfolk, found themselves pushed aside. Protestant reformers tightened their grip, steering England further from Rome than Henry himself had ever dared. The death of the king was wrapped in incense and velvet, but it concealed a far greater truth. The real battle was not for Henry's legacy, but for England's future. Henry VIII's death did not end his influence. In many ways, It was only the beginning of his afterlife in English politics, religion, and memory. Though his body had collapsed into disease and decay, his shadow still loomed over England. His will laid out a clear line of succession: first Edward, then Mary, and finally Elizabeth. This careful planning ensured that all three of his children would one day wear the crown, a rare outcome in the brutal politics of Tudor England. Yet the way each of them ruled, Edward's radical Protestantism, Mary's Catholic restoration, and Elizabeth's compromise settlement, reflected the contradictions Henry himself had left unresolved. He had broken from Rome, but never fully embraced Protestantism. He had styled himself a religious reformer, but clung to many Catholic traditions. In death, as in life, Henry left behind a kingdom divided. Religious conflict was not his only legacy. Henry had also left his country financially drained. His wars against France and Scotland, his obsession with courtly display, and his endless construction projects had nearly bankrupted the crown. Monastic lands had been sold, coinage had been debased, and inflation spread through towns and villages. For ordinary people, Henry's death brought not relief but continued hardship. The image of Henry himself became part of the struggle for power. Protestants remembered him as the king who defied the Pope, while Catholics whispered of a ruler who died in spiritual torment, haunted by the ghosts of his victims. Artists and propagandists reshaped his reputation. Portraits showed him not as the bloated tyrant who died at Whitehall, but as the strong, commanding figure of his youth, broad-shouldered, fists on hips, daring Europe to challenge him. In time, Henry VIII became less a man than a myth. He was remembered as the king who married 6 times, who broke with Rome, who executed rivals and wives with terrifying ease. But behind the myth lay the more human truth: a ruler destroyed by his own body, terrified of judgment, clinging to power even as life slipped away. Henry's reign had begun with promise, a golden prince admired across Europe, and ended with a king who could barely walk, who screamed in pain in the night, and who ruled through fear rather than love. Yet his impact on England was undeniable. He had reshaped the monarchy, altered religion forever, and left a dynasty that would dominate the century. Henry VIII died as he had lived, larger than life, feared, hated, admired, but never ignored. His legacy was one of blood and power, a reminder that even kings cannot escape the decay of flesh, nor the judgment of history.